He signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning without looking up from his phone. Adrian Cross didn't even put down his coffee. Alara stood across the mahogany desk in his penthouse study, watching her husband of 5 years reduce their marriage to an inconvenience between calendar appointments. The paper sat between them like something already dead. She picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake. That was the part that would haunt him later. How still her hand was when she signed her name for the last time. She set the pen down. She pulled off her wedding ring. Not dramatically, not with tears, just quietly, the way you'd remove a bandage you'd forgotten you were wearing, and placed it on top of the papers. Alara, don't. Her voice was soft, not broken, just finished. You made your choice, Adrian. I'm respecting it. She walked out without looking back. He watched her go and felt nothing he expected to feel. No guilt, no relief, just a faint, unsettling stillness, like the air before weather you can't yet name. 3 days later, the weather arrived. If you've ever watched someone discover they were wrong about everything, not just a fact, not just a decision, but the entire foundation of what they believed was real, then you understand what happened to Adrian Cross at 9:47 on a Thursday morning when the windows of his penthouse began to rattle. He thought it was construction. Chicago had been tearing itself apart all spring. Then the rattling became a roar. His assistant Marcus burst through the office door without knocking, which Marcus had never done in 4 years of employment. His face had lost most of its color. "Mr. Cross, you need to come to the window." Adrian didn't move immediately. He had a conference call in 11 minutes and a merger document that still needed his signature. "Marcus, whatever it is, sir." Something in Marcus's voice made Adrian stand up. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lakeshore Drive and the blue sprawl of Lake Michigan beyond. And what he saw made him understand for the first time in his adult life what it felt like to have the ground removed from beneath his feet. There were 3 of them. Black helicopters, military grade, the kind you don't see over civilian airspace unless something has gone catastrophically wrong or someone with extraordinary power has decided the rules don't apply to them. They were descending toward the street below with the calm precision of machines that had done this 1,000 times. Traffic had already stopped. Not because of police, Adrian could see the police cruisers sitting motionless at the intersection, officers standing beside their vehicles with their hands at their sides, not reaching for radios, not directing anything, just watching. The way you watch something you know you cannot interfere with. "What is this?" Adrian's voice came out quieter than he intended. Marcus said nothing, because Marcus didn't know, and they both understood in that moment that whatever this was, it existed in a register entirely beyond their comprehension. The lead helicopter touched down on Adrian's front plaza. The doors opened. 12 men in black tactical clothing stepped out first, moving outward in a practice sweep that cleared the perimeter in under 40 seconds. They weren't police. They weren't military. Not American military, anyway. The way they moved was different, economical, like men who had learned their craft somewhere that didn't have oversight. Then one more figure stepped out of the helicopter. Tall, dark suit, no tie, the jacket cut with the kind of precision that didn't come from anywhere with a storefront. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had been handsome in youth and had become something more severe than handsome over time. There was no hurry in the way he moved, none whatsoever. He crossed the plaza without looking at anything or anyone. No, that wasn't quite right. He was looking at one thing. Adrian followed this man's sightline and felt his chest go cold. Alara was standing at the edge of the plaza. Adrian hadn't known she was there. He still didn't understand why she was there. She'd been gone for 3 days. He'd assumed she was staying with friends, processing the divorce, doing whatever quiet, unremarkable Alara Vale did when her life changed. He had not thought about her much. That was the truth, and it would become one of the things he could least forgive himself for. She stood very still as the man in the dark suit approached her. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was— Adrian pressed closer to the glass, trying to read it from 15 stories up. Not frightened, not relieved exactly. Something more complicated. The expression of someone arriving at the end of a very long road they'd been walking alone for years. The man stopped in front of her. Then, and Adrian Cross would replay this moment for the rest of his life, the man lowered himself to one knee. In the middle of Adrian's plaza, in front of his building, in front of the frozen police and the stopped traffic, and the watching city. He knelt before Alara Vale, the woman Adrian had divorced 3 days ago for being nobody. Even from 15 stories up, Adrian could read what the man said. Maybe because the words were simple, maybe because some part of Adrian had already begun to understand that everything he believed was collapsing. My queen, it's time to come home. Her name wasn't Alara Vale. That was the first thing. Adrian discovered this not from any official source. No official source would talk to him, a fact that he would spend the next 72 hours slamming against like a man who didn't understand why a door wouldn't open. He discovered it the way desperate people discover things, by pulling at every loose thread he could find until something finally tore. Her enrollment records at the University of Illinois were real on the surface. Transcripts, an ID photo, a student number. But the student number belonged to a record created in a database that hadn't existed until 18 months before Alara supposedly enrolled. The photo was her. The rest was constructed, a backdrop painted to look like a history. Her apartment before their marriage. He'd been to it once, early in their relationship, and he'd found it sparse and a little sterile, the kind of space that could be cleared in 2 hours. He'd attributed it to a minimalist personality. It had not occurred to him that it was the apartment of someone who had learned to live without things that could be left behind. The foster home listed in her records, the one she'd mentioned vaguely, painfully, on the 2 or 3 occasions she'd spoken about her childhood, had been closed for 15 years. The caseworker whose name appeared in her file had died in a car accident in 2009. He hired a private investigator, a former federal agent named Garza, who charged 3 times the going rate, and, in Adrian's experience, was worth every dollar. Garza called him on the 4th day with the kind of professional flatness that meant the man was sitting with something he didn't like. "The fingerprints," Garza said. "What about them?" "I ran them through every database I have access to, which is more databases than you'd think." A pause. "They match a record for a Jane Doe who died in a house fire in rural Connecticut in 2004. The Jane Doe was approximately 4 to 6 years old at time of death. The remains were never formally identified." Adrian sat down on his desk. He missed the chair. He sat on the floor and didn't bother correcting it. "That's not possible." "No," Garza said. "It's not. Which means someone with access to federal biometric systems went to considerable trouble to make it appear that way. I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Cross. Whoever built this woman's identity was operating at a level that makes me very uncomfortable continuing this particular line of investigation. I'm paying you You could pay me 10 times what you're paying me, and I would tell you the same thing. There are people you hire when you want information, and there are people you don't investigate unless you're prepared for what comes after. Whoever she is, whoever she was protected by the second kind." Another pause. "I'd suggest you think carefully about why they let her near you in the first place." Garza hung up. Adrian stayed on the floor for a long time. "Well, I went to Vivian Knox's office the following morning because Vivian was the one who had started all of this. Vivian Knox had been his business partner for 3 years. Brilliant, relentless, the kind of operator who could read a room and a balance sheet with equal precision. She'd come to him 6 weeks ago with documents, financial records showing unusual withdrawals timed to sensitive company decisions, subtle interference in procurement contracts, a pattern that, laid out on paper, pointed unmistakably toward someone with inside access. She'd pointed at Alara. He'd asked her if she was certain. She'd said yes. He hadn't asked many questions after that, which was something else he would have to live with. Now he sat across from Vivian in her glass-walled office on the 32nd floor of the Knox and Cross building and looked at her with new eyes and tried to understand what he was actually looking at. Vivian was composed. She was always composed. But there was something under the composure today, a kind of watchfulness, that he hadn't noticed before or hadn't been paying enough attention to notice. "The man who came for Alara," he said without preamble. "Dante Moretti." Vivian's expression didn't change, but her hands, resting on the desk, went very slightly still. "I've heard the name," she said. "Everyone with any exposure to international business has heard the name, Vivian. He's not a rumor. He runs an empire that operates across 4 continents and has arrangements with governments that aren't supposed to have arrangements with people like him. And he came to my building and knelt in the street for the woman you told me was embezzling from my company." He leaned forward. "So I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to hear how serious I am when I ask it. Did you manufacture those documents?" Vivian looked at him for a long, measured moment. "Adrian," she said, and her voice was the same voice it always was, reasonable, assured, the voice of the smartest person in any given room. "You've had a difficult week. The divorce was hard, and now this spectacle with the helicopters has clearly shaken you. I think you should take a few days. Did you manufacture the documents?" She held his gaze. "No," she said. He studied her face and realized with a cold and clarifying horror that he could not tell if she was lying. He had worked alongside this woman for 3 years, had trusted her with information that could ruin him, had built half his professional identity alongside hers, and in this moment he genuinely could not read her. That was when he understood that he might never have been able to. Cross Dynamics began losing money on the 9th day. Not dramatically, not visibly. That was what made it so disorienting. There was no single catastrophic event to point at, no hostile takeover announcement, no news cycle. Just a series of small, separate, individually explicable events that Adrian could not have connected into a pattern if he hadn't been watching for one. The Harwick Group, a private equity firm that had been a Cross Dynamics partner for 6 years, quietly declined to extend their credit line. Their representative cited portfolio restructuring. His voice was pleasant and apologetic and told Adrian exactly nothing. A senior vice president named Collins resigned on a Tuesday, citing personal reasons. Collins had been with the company for 9 years and had mentioned at the Christmas party 4 months ago that he planned to retire from Cross Dynamics. He sent his resignation via email and did not answer his phone. 3 days later, a federal inquiry that had been closed 18 months ago, a routine review of a real estate acquisition that had ultimately produced no findings, was quietly reopened. The notice came through legal channels, all perfectly proper, accompanied by a document request that would require 6 months of staff time to fulfill. None of these things, individually, would have concerned Adrian past the level of ordinary business friction. Together they formed a message so clear it might as well have been printed on paper and left on his desk. He sat with his general counsel, Thomas Reeves, on a Thursday afternoon, looking at the pattern laid out across a conference table, and Reeves, a man who had navigated 30 years of corporate law without visibly breaking a sweat, looked genuinely unsettled. "This isn't a coincidence," Reeves said. "No. This level of coordinated pressure across different regulatory bodies and financial institutions simultaneously requires either a government agency with a specific mandate against you, which I'd know about, or," he stopped, "or someone who operates outside government structures but has relationships within them," Adrian finished. Reeves said nothing. "Dante Moretti," Adrian said, "publicly stated through his representatives that he bears me no personal animosity." "When did he state that?" "Day 2. His people sent a very polite communication through an attorney in Milan. I am not a target of the Moretti organization. I am a private individual of no interest to them." He looked at the document spread across the table, "which either means Moretti is lying or—" He stopped. The thought that had been forming in the back of his mind for days solidified into something he could hold. "Or someone else is doing this," he said slowly, "and Moretti is telling the truth." Reeves studied him. "If Moretti didn't order this, then whoever is destroying my company is also an enemy of Moretti's, and they're using me." Adrian stood up from the table. "I was never the target, Thomas. I was the instrument." He left Reeves in the conference room and went to stand at his window again, looking out at the city, and tried to understand the full shape of what he was inside. Someone had wanted Elara exposed, wanted her identity as Moretti's, but as whatever she was to Moretti, forced into the open. And the cleanest way to do that was to detonate her marriage, push her out into the open, and watch who came running. Adrian had handed them everything they needed by being exactly the kind of man he'd been. He pressed his hand flat against the cold glass and tried to think past the nausea. Vivian Knox had brought him those documents. Vivian Knox, who had been his partner for 3 years, who had arrived in his professional life with impeccable credentials and better instincts, who had always seemed to know exactly what he needed to hear. Who had she been working for? And more urgently, more immediately, what had Elara walked back into? He tried to reach her through the only channel that seemed possible. A message sent through the Milan attorney, addressed formally to Miss Elara Moretti and requesting acknowledgement of receipt. The acknowledgement came back in 4 hours. 2 lines. I received your message. I am safe. Please do not attempt further contact. He read it 6 times. Each time he found himself trying to parse not just the words, but the woman who had written them. The Alara he had lived with for 5 years would have softened it, would have added something small, an acknowledgement of his concern, a courtesy that cost her nothing because she had always been naturally courteous. Even in the worst moments of their marriage, even in the silences that had grown between them like rooms filling with water, she had never been cold. These 2 lines were not warm. They were not cruel either. They were the communication of someone who had made a clean accounting of what was owed and found the balance was 0. He had done that. He had made her that way, at least toward him. He put the message down and made a different decision. He needed to know who Vivian Knox actually was. Not the version he'd been given, the real one. He needed to understand what Lorenzo Baresi had to do with any of this, because the name had come up twice now in the financial investigative trail, glancing references and documents his team had pulled, a shadow behind several of the institutions that had quietly retreated from his company. And he needed to decide what kind of man he was going to be when he finally understood the full picture. Because the man he had been, the one who signed divorce papers without looking up from his phone, that man, he was beginning to understand, had been built by the same carelessness that made him easy to use. He didn't know yet what it would cost him to become a different one, but in the hollowed-out quiet of his office, listening to a city that had watched everything he thought he knew fall apart in a single morning, he decided he was going to find out. Adrian Cross spent the next 4 days becoming a different kind of man. Not a better one. Not yet. Just a more dangerous one, in the specific way that people become dangerous when they stop protecting their own comfort and start paying attention to what's actually in front of them. He let Marcus go home. He stopped taking calls from the board. He pulled every document Vivian Knox had ever given him and spread them across the conference table in his private office and went through them the way Garza had taught him to go through things. Not looking for what was there, but looking for what was missing. What was missing was a paper trail, not the documents themselves. The documents were immaculate, beautifully sourced, cross-referenced, internally consistent. That was the problem. In Adrian's experience, real financial malfeasance was messy. It left contradictions, timestamps that didn't line up, transfers that required a second look. The documents Vivian had given him were too clean, as though someone had spent considerable time making sure every thread led back to the right conclusion without any loose ends that might snag. You only did that kind of careful work when you already knew where you wanted someone to land. He called Garza at 11 on a Wednesday night. "Vivian Knox," he said when Garza picked up. "Full background, whatever it costs." A pause. "This connected to the other thing?" "I think so." "Adrian." Garza rarely used his first name. "The other thing. The fingerprints, the manufactured identity, the Moretti name sitting in the middle of all of it. I wasn't kidding when I said I'm not comfortable continuing. That's a level of exposure I'm not asking you to go after Moretti. I'm asking you to find out who Vivian Knox was before she walked into my life." Another pause. Longer. "That's a distinction that might not hold. Can you do it or not?" Garza did it. The report came back in 48 hours, which told Adrian that either Garza had already been looking or Vivian Knox's background was considerably easier to penetrate than Alara's had been. He suspected both. He read it in his car in the parking structure beneath his building, engine off, the concrete around him silent and gray. He read it twice. Then he sat with the windows fogging slightly from his breath and tried to restructure everything he knew. Vivian Knox had been born in Lyon, France, to a French mother and an American father. Educated in Geneva, London, and then Columbia for her MBA. Her career trajectory was clean and credentialed. 2 years at McKinsey, 3 at a private equity group in Frankfurt, then into the world of boutique investment partnerships, where she'd eventually ended up crossing his path at a conference in Singapore 4 years ago. Perfectly constructed. But Garza, who had more databases than he should, had found a photograph. It was 3 years old, taken at what appeared to be a private function somewhere along the Amalfi Coast. The photo had been pulled from the background of someone else's social media. Not tagged, not centered, not intended to be found. In it, Vivian Knox stood at the edge of a terrace, a drink in her hand, speaking with a man whose face was turned partially away from the camera. Garza had identified the man from his profile, his build, the signet ring on his right hand that appeared in other photographs from the same period. Lorenzo Baresi, 61 years old, Sicilian-born, Rome-educated, operating primarily out of a legitimate-facing investment structure headquartered in Brussels. On paper, a financier with interests in logistics, private security contracting, and Mediterranean real estate. Off paper, the oldest and most sustained rival of the Moretti organization, a man who had been trying to dismantle Dante Moretti's empire for going on 2 decades, and who had, according to every analyst who tracked the underworld from a safe distance, become considerably more reckless in recent years. A man who had been photographed on a private terrace with Adrian's business partner 3 years before Vivian handed him those documents about Alara. 3 years, which meant this hadn't been opportunistic. Vivian hadn't seen a crack in Adrian's marriage and decided to exploit it. She'd been placed, she'd been in position, building his trust, waiting for the right moment, for 3 years. He'd been a job. Adrian sat in his car and breathed through the anger because the anger was useless, and he knew it. He'd built companies. He knew what useless resources looked like, and he didn't spend them. What he needed to understand now was why. Not why Baresi wanted to destroy the Moretti organization. That was obvious. That was decades of territorial conflict compressed into motive. But why the elaborate machinery of manufacturing a marriage, then destroying it, to force Alara into the open? What did her exposure accomplish that direct action couldn't? He needed someone who understood the Moretti world from the inside. And there was exactly one person he could think of who might talk to him. The Milan attorney's name was Cecilia Ferro, and she had agreed to meet him only because he'd had the presence of mind to phrase his request in a way that suggested he had information relevant to the safety of her client, rather than a request for information from her. They met in a private room at a hotel in downtown Chicago, neutral ground that Ferro had selected, which Adrian took as a sign that she was, at minimum, genuinely curious about what he knew. She was somewhere in her 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and the settled, unhurried manner of someone who had spent a career navigating situations that would have buckled most people. She ordered espresso. She did not offer small talk. "Vivian Knox," Adrian said, placing Garza's report on the table between them. "Lorenzo Baresi. The photo is on page 3. Ferro didn't reach for the report immediately. She looked at him. "What is it you want, Mr. Cross?" "To understand what Alara walked back into, and to know if she's actually safe. She is under the protection of an organization that has an active enemy willing to construct a 3-year operation to expose her location," Adrian said. "I know what I was. I'm not here to rehabilitate myself. I'm here because I have information that may be useful to the people around her, and because whoever built this used me without my knowledge or consent, and I am not willing to be a passive instrument in something I don't understand." Ferro regarded him for a long moment, then she picked up the report. She read the relevant pages without visible reaction, but Adrian had spent years in rooms reading people, and he caught the small things, the slight tightening around her eyes at the photograph, the almost imperceptible pause before she turned the page. "You verified this," she said. "My investigator did. The metadata on the photo is clean. It wasn't manipulated." Ferro set the report down. She looked at her espresso rather than at him. "The timing of your divorce," she said carefully. "It places the activation of this plan approximately 8 months ago, which means the decision to move was made around—" She stopped. "Around when?" Adrian asked. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration of what she thought he was worth. "Around the time of a significant internal event within the organization," she said. "One that would not be public knowledge." "What kind of event?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, someone inside the Moretti family began positioning for a transition of power. Quietly. Over a period of months. The kind of internal pressure that is very difficult to trace precisely because the people applying it are trusted. Someone who wanted Alara out of the picture. Someone who knew what she represented, what she would mean if she returned. Ferro's voice was careful, every word placed. Alara was not simply hidden because of external threats, Mr. Cross. She was hidden because the threat was internal. Her mother's death was not an accident. The people responsible for it have been embedded in the Moretti organization for over 20 years, and they have been very patient. The room went quiet. She walked back into that, Adrian said. She walked back into it knowing exactly what it was. He absorbed that. She knew. She has always known. The question was never whether she understood the danger. The question was whether she was ready. Pharaoh paused. Dante Moretti spent 7 years preparing her for it. Before your marriage. During it. The years she spent with you were not wasted time, but they were not the entirety of her life. Something turned over in Adrian's chest. All those nights she came home late without explanation, the days she disappeared, the quality of her silences. Not the vacancy he'd read into them, but something more deliberate, a person keeping two worlds from collapsing into each other. She was training, he said. Pharaoh said nothing, which was its own answer. I flew to New York that evening because the next thread required a face rather than a phone, and because staying in Chicago felt increasingly like waiting inside a room that was slowly running out of air. Thomas Reeves had flagged something in the regulatory documentation, a name appearing twice in the reopened federal inquiry, not as a party to the investigation, but as a reference point, a prior contact. The name was Raymond Cho, a former federal prosecutor who had left government work 8 years ago and now operated a high-end legal consulting practice that Adrian had never had occasion to use. Cho had, apparently, appeared twice in paperwork connected to the original closure of the inquiry 18 months ago. Adrian had no formal appointment. He arrived at Cho's Park Avenue office on a Thursday morning and told the receptionist he was there regarding the Cross Dynamics inquiry, which was true enough to get him through the door. Cho met him in a conference room and was not pleased to see him. He was a compact, precise man in his mid-50s, the kind of person who had spent decades being the most controlled individual in any given situation, and Adrian's unannounced presence had punctured something he was working to reseal in real time. Mr. Cross, I have a full calendar today. The federal inquiry, Adrian said, the one that was closed 18 months ago and is now open again. Your name appears in the closure documentation. My name appears in a great deal of documentation. If you have legal questions about an active inquiry, you should direct them through your general counsel to the relevant "Who asked you to facilitate the closure?" Adrian said. Cho looked at him. 18 months ago, someone reached out to you. Someone with connections to the right people inside the regulatory body to make the initial inquiry go away before it produced anything on paper that anyone would have to respond to. And now whatever arrangement produced that closure has been voided, and the inquiry is back open, which tells me the people who arranged it are no longer in a position to maintain it. Adrian leaned forward slightly. Someone pulled the rug out from under you, Mr. Cho, and I'd like to know who you were working for when you were standing on it. Cho said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then he stood up and walked to the window, which looked out over Park Avenue and the ordinary morning traffic below, and the silence in the room became the kind of silence that means someone is deciding something important. I have never spoken about this, Cho said finally, with his back to Adrian. Not because of any formal obligation, because the people involved are not the kind you speak about. Lorenzo Baresi, Adrian said. Cho turned around. Whatever composure remained on his face went flat and still. You already know, he said. I know pieces. I need the shape. Cho came back to the table but didn't sit down. He gripped the back of a chair with both hands and looked at Adrian with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been given permission to set it down. Baresi's operation in the United States runs through 3 shell structures. I've known about 2 of them since my time in the federal system. The third, the one that touches cross dynamics, that one I didn't know about until someone brought it to me 18 months ago and made it very clear that making the inquiry go away was not a request. Who brought it to you? A woman. He paused. She said her name was Vivian Knox. Adrian got back to Chicago at 9 that night and found Marcus waiting in the lobby of his building with the specific expression of a man who has been told to wait and has been waiting for so long that the waiting has started to feel like its own kind of emergency. 3 things, Marcus said, falling into step beside him. The Harwick Group's withdrawal has been picked up by 2 financial news outlets. Nothing major yet, but it's starting to get traction online. Second, he pulled up something on his phone and handed it to Adrian. Collins gave an interview. He says the company is experiencing significant internal governance concerns. He didn't elaborate. Adrian handed the phone back. And the third thing. Marcus hesitated. Marcus. A woman came by this afternoon. She didn't give a name. She left an envelope at the front desk and said it was for you personally. He produced it from his jacket pocket. Security scanned it. No devices, no powders, just paper. Adrian took the envelope. His name was written on the front in handwriting he recognized immediately, which was not possible because he hadn't seen it written by hand in 5 years. And yet there it was, unmistakable. The particular precision of it, the letters sitting slightly more upright than most people's, as though whoever had written them was in the habit of disciplining everything about themselves. He opened it in the elevator. A single card. 4 lines. Stop investigating Cho. You've found what you needed, and going further puts you in Lorenzo's sightline directly. Pharaoh will tell Dante what you gave her. You did a useful thing. Leave it there. No signature. He read it twice, standing in the elevator as it climbed toward the 40th floor. She was watching him. Or someone watching for her was watching him, which meant the walls he'd thought were around him. The sense of operating in the dark, of fumbling toward information that the other players in this situation already possessed, were not walls at all. He was inside a room that had windows, and people outside those windows had been watching every move he made and judging, apparently, whether those moves were useful or dangerous. He'd been assessed, and she'd sent him a card telling him he'd passed, or at least not failed. It made him feel things he didn't have language for yet. Vivian Knox arrived at his office the following morning at 8 a.m., which meant she knew Marcus came in at 8:30 and had timed herself to arrive when Adrian would be alone. She walked in the way she always had, direct, unhurried, dressed with the understated precision that Adrian now understood as a kind of professional armor, and sat down across from him as though this were a scheduled meeting. "You talked to Cho," she said. "Yes." "You've been talking to a lot of people." She crossed her legs. Her hands rested easily on the arms of the chair. "Lorenzo knows you spoke to Pharaoh. He's not happy about it." "Is that a threat?" "It's a status update." She looked at him steadily. "Adrian, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without reaching for the phone." "Give me a reason." She held his gaze. "The documents I gave you. They were fabricated, as you figured out. I was operating under instruction from Lorenzo Baresi, as you've also figured out." She paused. "What you haven't figured out is that I have been feeding information about Baresi's operation to the Moretti organization for 14 months. I am not Lorenzo's asset. I am his liability. And I have been trying very carefully, for over a year, to maneuver this situation toward a resolution that doesn't get anyone I care about killed." Adrian looked at her for a long moment. "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to look at the evidence you've assembled and ask yourself how you found it so readily." Her voice was quiet, precise. "Cho, the photograph, the shell structures. I left those threads where you'd find them. I needed you to build the picture independently so that when you brought it to Pharaoh, it would land with the weight of discovery and not suggestion." She paused. Elara needed Dante to understand the full shape of what Baresi has built inside his own organization. The information had to come from outside, from someone with no apparent stake in the Moretti world, from someone who had, in fact, been visibly wronged by the situation. The word wronged sat in the room between them. "You needed a credible outside source," Adrian said. "I needed someone who would actually look, who had enough intelligence to find things and enough anger to keep pulling at them." Her eyes were steady on his. "You qualified on both counts." He wanted to feel used. He did feel used. But underneath that was something more complicated. The recognition that being used was different from being worthless. That she'd aimed him at a target and he'd hit it, and the target mattered. "Lorenzo," he said. "What is he actually planning?" Vivian was quiet for a moment, and in that moment Adrian saw something beneath the composure for the first time. Not fear, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of someone who has been calculating odds for a very long time and has just completed a calculation that came out badly. "He's not just trying to weaken the Moretti organization anymore," she said. "He's moving, actively, within the next 3 to 4 weeks. Senators have been contacted. Federal relationships have been leveraged. He has people inside the Moretti Council, I don't know how many, I don't know which ones, who are positioned to collapse the internal command structure the moment he launches his external offensive." The internal traitor, Adrian said, and thought of what Pharaoh had told him. Alara's mother's death. 20 years of patience. Someone who has been inside a long time. Yes, Vivian's voice dropped very slightly. And whoever it is, they know Alara is back. They know what she represents. She becomes the target the moment Baresi launches. Adrian's chest went tight. Does Dante know about the internal threat? Dante suspects. He doesn't know who, and the timing. She stopped. What about the timing? Dante was shot 3 days ago. She said it flatly, watching his face. A security breach during a transfer between facilities. He's alive. He's being treated. But his operational capacity is severely compromised. And the people inside his council know it, and the people inside his council who are loyal to Baresi are... They're positioning, Adrian said. Right now, as we sit here. He stood up from the desk. The full structure of it was visible to him now, in a way it hadn't been 20 minutes ago. Baresi launches his external offensive. Senators, federal leverage, public spectacle. Simultaneously, his embedded people inside the Moretti organization fracture the internal command. Dante is compromised and can't hold the line. The organization collapses inward. And Alara, who came back to lead, who Dante spent 7 years preparing, Alara is isolated inside a structure that has been rotted from within, surrounded by people she cannot yet distinguish from enemies. He picked up his phone. Who are you calling? Vivian asked. Pharaoh. He found the number. She needs to get a message through, right now. Vivian stood up. Her voice was careful. Adrian, if you make this call, you are not an outside observer anymore. You become a participant. Lorenzo will know. His people inside the Moretti organization will flag it. You will be... Vivian. He looked at her. Stop. He pressed call. Pharaoh answered on the second ring. It's Cross, he said. Dante's been shot. You need to know that Baresi has people inside the council. I don't have names yet, but I'm working on it, and I'll get them to you. And Alara... He stopped, steadied himself. Tell her she needs to watch her own people. The threat isn't coming from outside the walls. A silence on the line. Then Pharaoh's voice, very controlled. How long have you known this? About 4 minutes? Another silence. I'll pass it through. He ended the call and stood in the middle of his office with the phone in his hand and the city spread out behind him through the glass, ordinary and enormous, indifferent to the particular catastrophe assembling itself within it. Vivian was watching him. There are names, he said, inside the Moretti Council. I need you to get them to me. I told you, I don't know. Then find out. His voice was harder than he'd intended, or maybe exactly as hard as he'd intended. You've been running this long game for 14 months. You have to have more than you've given me. Names, structures, anything. Because right now Alara is inside that organization, Dante is down, and whatever Baresi has been building is about to detonate. And if we don't get her real information, she is going to be navigating that collapse without knowing which people standing next to her are trying to put her in the ground. Vivian looked at him for a long, still moment. You know, she said quietly, for a man who signed divorce papers without looking up from his phone, you are making a considerable number of inconvenient choices right now. Yes, he said. I'm aware. She held his gaze. Then something in her settled. Not defeat, but decision. The look of someone reaching the end of a calculation and accepting the answer. I have one name, she said. I'm not certain of it, but it's the one that keeps appearing in patterns I can't account for any other way. She paused. It's someone Dante trusts completely, has trusted for 30 years, someone who helped raise him. The air in the room changed. Tell me, Adrian said. And Vivian said a name that made the entire structure of the last 5 years. The marriage, the divorce, the helicopters, all of it, suddenly snap into a different shape entirely. One that was darker and older and far more patient than anything Adrian had imagined he was standing inside. The name Vivian said was Matteo De Luca. Adrian didn't recognize it immediately. It took him 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which Vivian watched his face with the careful attention of someone waiting to see whether a structure they'd built would hold weight before the name connected to anything. And then it did, and the connection was not dramatic. It was quiet, the way the worst things usually were. Matteo De Luca. He'd seen the name in passing, in the financial documentation Garza had assembled. Not as a primary figure, as a reference point. a senior figure within the Moretti organizational structure, listed in several of the legitimate-facing business entities as a director emeritus, the kind of title that meant someone had earned the right to exist in the background without being asked to explain themselves. 67 years old, Sicilian-born, had been with the Moretti family since before Dante was an adult. He helped raise Dante, Adrian said. He was there when Dante's father died. He was there for everything after. Vivian's voice was very controlled. He is the person Dante goes to when he doesn't know what to do. Has been for 30 years. And you think he's the one who had Alara's mother killed? I think he's the one who has been inside this organization for 2 decades, ensuring that Alara never came home. And I think Lorenzo Baresi didn't recruit him. She paused. I think it was the other way around. I think Matteo De Luca found Lorenzo Baresi and handed him the tools to threaten the Moretti Empire from outside, specifically so that the external pressure would give him cover for what he's been doing from within. The room was very quiet. He built the enemy, Adrian said. He built the distraction, Vivian said. Lorenzo is real. His organization is real. His rivalry with Dante is real. But it has been sustained and amplified for 20 years by someone feeding information, resources, and strategic intelligence to the other side. Not because Matteo De Luca serves Lorenzo Baresi. Her eyes were steady. Because he serves himself. And the only thing standing between Matteo and absolute control of the Moretti Empire is Dante, who is currently unconscious in a medical facility, and Alara, who just walked back inside the walls. Alara had been back inside the Moretti estate outside Geneva for 11 days when she understood that something was wrong with the air. Not wrong in any way she could point to. Nothing visible. Nothing a rational person would have flagged as evidence of anything. Just a quality to the silences in certain rooms. A particular pattern to the way some people moved when they didn't know she was watching. Too casual, the way people move when they've been instructed to appear casual rather than simply being it. She'd been trained to read rooms. Dante had started teaching her when she was 19, 2 years before she met Adrian, in the same methodical way he approached everything. Not by explaining the principles, but by putting her in situations and asking her afterward what she'd noticed. What the man across the room had done with his hands. Whether the woman by the window had looked at the door before or after the sound from the hallway. Small things. The architecture of intent that people constructed unconsciously around themselves. She walked the estate in the mornings, always the same route, because predictability was a tool when used deliberately. It told you who altered their own routines to accommodate yours. 3 people had altered their routines. A security coordinator named Reyes, a financial analyst named Soren, who had been with the organization for 6 years, and an older woman named Carla, who ran the domestic staff and had, in Alara's earliest childhood memories of this place, always seemed to know where everyone was. 3 people. Not necessarily connected, not necessarily anything, but she noted them. She was sitting in the East Library on the 12th morning, reading documentation that Dante's legal team had prepared on the organizational structure, reading it with the specific attention of someone looking for what wasn't there, when Pharaoh came in and closed the door behind her with the kind of care that meant the conversation that followed would not be routine. "I need you to hear something," Pharaoh said, "and I need you to sit with it before you react." Alara set the document down. "Tell me." "Adrian Cross has been," Pharaoh paused, choosing the word, "active. He has been building a picture of what Baresi has constructed, and he has been doing it with considerable intelligence and more persistence than I would have predicted." She sat down across from Alara. "He reached out yesterday with information about the internal threat, specifically that Baresi has embedded people inside the council. He doesn't have names yet, but he is trying to get them." Alara was quiet for a moment. "He called you?" "Yes." "He's past the point where I told him to stop." "Yes." Pharaoh's voice was careful. "He appears to have found that instruction difficult to follow." Alara looked at her hands. She had known, in some abstract way, that Adrian would not simply absorb what had happened and return to his life. He was not built for passivity. It was one of the things she had loved about him, and also one of the things that had made living beside him exhausting, the constant momentum, the sense that everything was always accelerating toward the next objective, the next acquisition, the next version of himself. It had taken her years to understand that what looked like confidence was partly a fear of stopping, because stopping meant accounting for what was actually there. I was accounting now, it seemed. What did he say exactly? She said. About the internal threat. Threat, Pharaoh told her. Alara listened without interrupting, and when Pharaoh finished, she sat with it for a moment, running it against what she already knew, what she'd been observing. He's right, she said. There are people inside. I've been watching 3 of them. Pharaoh leaned forward slightly. You have names. I have observations, which is not the same thing yet. Alara stood up. How is Dante? Stable. He'll be operational in how many days, specifically? Pharaoh hesitated. 10 to 14 before he can resume any real command function. The wound was, so we have 10 to 14 days with the head of this organization incapacitated, a known external offensive being constructed by Baresi, and an unknown number of internal actors positioned to collapse command structure the moment that offensive launches. Alara said it without inflection, the way you state a problem before you begin solving it. Where's the council meeting scheduled for Thursday? The secure room on the 2nd level as move it. New location, announced less than an hour before. Don't tell anyone the new location in advance except the 3 people you trust completely. And I mean people you have known for decades, whose families you know, whose history inside this organization you can account for start to finish. Alara moved toward the door. And get me access to Dante. I don't need him to command anything. I need to talk to him. She stopped at the door and looked back at Pharaoh. And send Adrian Cross a message for me. Pharaoh waited. Tell him he's done enough. Tell him to go somewhere public, somewhere with cameras, and stay there. And tell him... She stopped, a pause that had weight in it. Tell him I said thank you. Dante was conscious, which was not the same as well. He was lying in a reinforced medical suite 2 levels below the estate's main floor, surrounded by equipment that hummed quietly, and 2 security personnel who stepped back when Alara entered but did not leave. His color was wrong, too gray, the particular grayness of someone whose body is diverting most of its resources inward. His eyes, though, were the same. They had always been the same regardless of circumstances, dark and very still, like water with depth you couldn't estimate from the surface. You look worse than I expected, Alara said. You look better than I expected. His voice was rough. Sit down. She sat in the chair beside his bed. For a moment, neither of them said anything, which was comfortable in the way that silences between people with long history can be. Not empty, just resting. Matteo came to see me yesterday, Dante said. Something went still in Alara's chest. What did he say? He was concerned about my recovery, about the timeline for resuming operations. He wanted to know who I designated to manage council communications while I was... He stopped. Something moved across his face. He wanted to know the chain of command. Alara looked at him. You told him, she said. I told him what I would tell any senior member of my organization who had been beside me for 30 years. His jaw tightened. What is it? Dante. She chose her words carefully. What do you know about Matteo's relationship with Lorenzo Baresi? The silence that followed was different from the earlier one. They've had minor intersections over the years, Dante said slowly. Business overlaps. Nothing operational. I would know if there were... Would you? He looked at her. The gray in his face had taken on a different quality. Tell me what you know, he said. His voice had gone very flat, the way it went when he was absorbing something painful and choosing not to let the pain show in his face. Alara told him what Vivian had told Adrian, what Adrian had passed to Pharaoh, what Pharaoh had passed to her. She told him about the organizational pattern she'd been observing in the 11 days since her return. She told him about Reyes and Soren and Carla. She told him about the structural logic of it, why someone inside wouldn't simply work against the organization outright, but would build an external threat large enough to create internal chaos, and then position themselves to step into the collapse. She told him everything, and she watched his face as she did. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done, not because of the information itself, but because of what it was doing to him. The visible, controlled dismantling of something he had believed was solid, something that had been the architecture of his life for 30 years. Matteo De Luca had sat at his table, had been in the room when Dante got the news of his father's death, had helped him make the decision to hide Alara, had been consulted on every major operational question for decades, and had been, throughout all of it, building something in the negative space. Dante was quiet for a long time when she finished. "Your mother," he said finally. "Yes." Another silence. "I should have—" "Stop." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Don't do that. It doesn't help anything and we don't have time for it." She leaned forward. "Matteo knows the chain of command now. He knows you're down for 10 to 14 days. Baresi is moving within 3 to 4 weeks by the best estimates we have, which means Matteo will coordinate his internal action to land simultaneous with Baresi's external offensive." She paused. "Unless we give him a reason to move sooner, on our terms, before he's ready." Dante looked at her. "You want to flush him," he said. "I want to hand him something that looks like an opportunity he can't afford to pass up," Alara said. "Something that would make him believe the window is now, not in 3 weeks, so that he moves before Baresi is in position to support him, so that he's exposed and isolated when he does." "What kind of something?" "Information that I've been found. That Lorenzo has people moving on the estate. That you've made a decision to transfer operational authority, temporarily, to someone Matteo will want to intercept before that transfer is completed." She held Dante's gaze. "Let him think he has 48 hours before the opportunity closes, and then be ready for what he does with those 48 hours. Dante studied her for a long moment. The gray in his face had not improved, but his eyes were sharper now, the sharpness of someone whose body was struggling and whose mind had decided not to participate in the struggle. "This was what I trained you for," he said quietly. Not with pride exactly, with something more complicated. "I know," she said. "Let me do it." The first thing went wrong 18 hours later. Alara had constructed the false information package carefully, not too elaborate, nothing that would require Matteo to make a leap, just a credible chain of developments that pointed to urgency. She'd had Pharaoh insert it through 2 separate internal channels, both of which Matteo had access to, neither of which would have been obvious as coordinated. She'd expected him to reach out through an intermediary, to probe the information quietly before acting. That was how careful men operated. Instead, Reyes came to her door at 6 in the morning and told her there was an urgent security matter on the west perimeter. Alara looked at him. Reyes was mid-40s, ex-military, by the way he stood. He'd been with the Moretti organization for 9 years. He had a family, a wife, 2 daughters, one of whom was in school in Lyon. He had always been professionally correct in every interaction Alara had observed. She looked at his hands. They were very still. "What kind of matter?" she said. "Motion sensors on the western fence line, multiple contacts, possibly a probe from—" He stopped. "From Baresi's people," she finished. "Yes." She looked at him for one more second, at the hands, at the stillness, at the specific quality of his eyes, which were not quite meeting hers. "Send Pharaoh to me," she said. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." She closed the door. She did not go to the west perimeter. She went instead to the secure communications room 2 hallways away, locked the door behind her, and pulled up the internal security feed for the west perimeter. There was nothing on the motion sensors. She pulled up the feed for the hallway she'd just been standing in. Reyes was still there, outside her door, and he was on his phone. The audio pickup was not close enough to get words, but she could read the shape of it. Brief, clipped, the conversation of someone confirming rather than reporting. He was telling someone she wasn't coming. She had approximately 4 minutes before whoever was waiting at the west perimeter redirected. She used 2 of them to send an encrypted message to the 3 people Pharaoh had identified as fully trusted. She used 1 more to move the location of Dante's medical suite in the building's internal directory. A technical misdirection, buying time. She used the last minute to arm herself. The estate had 12 weapons secured in accessible locations throughout the building, a system Dante had designed years ago on the principle that distance to a weapon was the variable most likely to get someone killed. Alara had spent the first 3 days after her return memorizing all 12 locations. The nearest one was in a panel behind a painting at the end of the hallway, 8 meters from where she was standing. She opened the communications room door. Reyes was gone. She moved to the painting, got the weapon, checked it, loaded, clean, exactly as it should be. And then she stood in the hallway and listened to the building. What she heard was the sound of the estate operating normally, staff moving through the kitchen level below, the distant percussion of kitchen work, the ordinary texture of a large house in the early morning, and underneath it, if you were listening for it, something else. A quality to the silence on the east stairwell that was not quite right. Not sound. The absence of the small sounds that should have been there. Someone was on the east stairwell, not making noise. She moved, not toward the stairwell, away from it, through the secondary corridor that connected to the back service passage, moving fast and low, the weapon in her right hand with the safety still on, because the safety being off was a decision you made at the moment of necessity and not before. She came out above the stairwell through the maintenance access, which gave her a view down into it. 3 men. Not estate security. The gear was wrong, too tactical, too coordinated with each other. Moving upward toward the floor where Dante's medical suite had been before she'd moved the directory entry. The man at the front of the 3 turned his head slightly, and she saw his profile. Soren. The financial analyst, the second of her 3. He wasn't a financial analyst. Whatever else he was not that. She pulled back from the access point and ran through the logic in the 4 seconds she had before she needed to move. 3 men going to a location that was now empty. When they found it empty, they would understand immediately that the information had been wrong, which meant someone had known they were coming, which meant the operation was blown, which meant whoever was coordinating this, Matteo, would shift immediately to contingency. She didn't know what the contingency was. She needed to know what the contingency was. There was one person who could tell her. She went to find Carla. Carla had been running the domestic staff of the Moretti estate for 22 years. She was 63, small, with white hair she kept pinned back severely, and the competent, unhurried manner of someone whose value to any household was so obvious that she'd never had to argue for it. She had known Alara as a child, had made her hot chocolate on winter mornings, had, when Alara was 6 years old, told her that the world was not as large as it seemed from inside these walls, and that she would understand why that mattered when she was older. Alara had been fond of her. Standing in Carla's sitting room on the ground floor, watching the older woman turn from the window with an expression that contained no surprise at all, Alara felt something she hadn't expected. Not betrayal. Something older and colder than that. "How long?" Alara said. Carla looked at her. Her hands were folded in front of her, the way they always were. "Since before you were born," she said. Her voice was quiet, steady, the voice of someone who had made peace with something a very long time ago. "Since your mother was still alive." The words hit Alara in a specific place, behind the sternum, where the things you've intellectually prepared for land when they become real. "You were there," Alara said, "when my mother died. I was in the house." A pause. "I didn't—" Carla stopped, looked at the floor, looked back up. There are choices you make when you are young and afraid, and someone older and more powerful than you tells you that this is how it will be. And then you live inside those choices for so long that they become the shape of your life, and the person you were before them is someone you can barely remember. That's not an explanation. "No," Carla said. "It isn't." Alara moved further into the room. "The 3 men going to Dante's floor, the operation Matteo is running right now, in this building. What is the contingency if the primary objective fails?" Carla looked at her for a long moment. "You," she said simply. "The contingency is you. It has always been you. Matteo cannot consolidate control while you are alive because you are the legitimate authority of this family, and every senior member of the organization knows it. Lorenzo is a distraction. Lorenzo has always been a distraction." She paused, and her voice dropped to something that was almost inaudible. "The plan was never to destroy the Moretti organization. The plan was to own it, and the only obstacle to that is me," Alara said. The door behind her opened. She turned. Matteo De Luca stood in the doorway. He was tall, even now, with the kind of physical presence that didn't diminish with age but changed quality, became something heavier, more deliberate. His hair was white and his face was deeply lined, and his eyes, looking at Alara across the sitting room of a woman who had just betrayed the last of his secrets, were the eyes of a man who had been carrying a plan for 23 years and had just arrived at the moment it either succeeded or didn't. He held a gun. He looked at her the way you look at a problem you've been trying to solve for most of your adult life and have finally, at considerable cost, cornered. "I didn't want this to be like this," he said, and his voice, His voice was actually sorry, in the specific way of people who distinguish between what they want and what they're willing to do, and have always been more governed by the latter. I watched you grow up in this house. I loved your mother, in my way. I loved Dante, in my way. But what your family built, he stopped. What your family built was always going to require someone to protect it from itself. Your father was brilliant and reckless. Your mother saw things too clearly and lived too openly, and it made everyone around her vulnerable. And you're explaining yourself, Alara said. Her voice was very flat. That means you haven't decided yet. He looked at her. I've decided, he said. No, she said. If you'd decided, you'd have sent the 3 men and never come here yourself. You came because you wanted me to understand, which means some part of you is still, don't, he said, and something in his voice cracked. Not broke. Cracked, the way old stone does under pressure that's been accumulating for years. Don't do what Dante does. Don't try to find the human being in the middle of a decision that has already been made. Matteo. Her voice was very quiet. I know who killed my mother. My mother, I have known for 4 years. I have had evidence since before I married Adrian Cross. She watched his face. I haven't used it. Do you want to know why? He was very still. Because I came back to build something, she said. Not to settle accounts. Not to punish. To build something that doesn't require a 16-year-old girl to be hidden with a manufactured identity in case the people inside her own family decide she's an inconvenience. Her voice stayed level, but there was something in it now. Not anger, something older than anger. You could have been part of that. You still could. Alara. His voice was rough. But if you pull that trigger, she said, the evidence I've assembled goes to every senior council member simultaneously, automatically, within the hour. I set that up 4 days ago. The information is already in motion. You would be killing me inside an organization that would have everything it needed to destroy you before Dante was back on his feet. She paused. Which means pulling that trigger doesn't give you control. It just makes you dead faster. The room was absolutely silent. Carla, behind Alara, had not moved. Matteo's gun hand was steady. She'd give him that. 23 years of patience, and the hand was steady. But his eyes were doing something complicated, running calculations she couldn't fully see, arriving at answers she couldn't predict. Then his phone vibrated. He didn't look at it, but she saw the way his jaw tightened. She said, very quietly, that's the 3 men reporting that Dante's floor was empty. He looked at her. Your primary objective failed, she said. Your contingency is standing in front of you telling you it won't work. And Lorenzo Baresi, who you've been funding and supporting and feeding intelligence for 20 years, is sitting in Brussels not knowing that his most important asset inside this organization has just been exposed. She took 1 step toward him. You have no board left to play. Something moved across Matteo De Luca's face. Not defeat, worse than defeat. The look of a man who has bet everything on a version of the future that no longer exists and is standing in the wreckage of the present trying to find a surface solid enough to stand on. His gun hand dropped 3 inches. It was not surrender. It was the beginning of a recalculation, and Alara knew, with the cold clarity of someone who had been trained by the most dangerous man she knew, that a recalculating Matteo De Luca was in some ways more dangerous than a decided one. She moved. Not away. Toward him, closing the distance before he could complete whatever new calculation was forming, because distance was the variable that got people killed, and she had not survived 23 years of being hunted inside her own family's walls to lose the moment she closed the last door. Her hand was on his wrist before he raised it. The struggle was brief and ugly and not remotely clean, because nothing real ever was, and when it ended, Matteo De Luca was against the wall with her forearm across his throat and the gun on the floor across the room, and the 2 of them breathing hard in the small space between what had just happened and whatever came next. He looked at her. She looked at him. And in that moment, with his back against the wall and her holding him there and the gun on the floor, and Carla very still behind them both, the phone in his pocket vibrated again. And this time, it was not the 3 men. She could see the screen from where she was. The message was from a contact listed only as L. Cross has been taken. Shipping facility, South Harbor. Execution broadcast in 6 hours. Choose. Her grip on Matteo's wrist went rigid. Adrian. Lorenzo had taken Adrian, and the execution was not just an execution, it was a message to her, a choice framed as a deadline, designed to force her out of the estate, away from the defensive ground she'd spent 11 days preparing, into an environment Baresi controlled in the next 6 hours. She let go of Matteo. She picked up the gun. She looked at Matteo De Luca and said, with a quietness that contained everything she'd been trained to be and everything the last 11 days had cost her, "We're not done. But right now I need to know everything you know about the South Harbor facility." And Matteo, looking at the woman who had just dismantled his 23-year plan with her hands and her evidence and her refusal to be the frightened girl he'd been counting on, made the decision that would define whatever remained of his life. He began to talk. Matteo talked for 19 minutes. Elara stood with her back against the wall and the gun in her hand and let him talk. And she did not interrupt him, and she did not look at Carla, who was still sitting in the chair by the window with her hands folded in her lap, like someone who had decided that stillness was the only dignity left available to her. Matteo talked about the South Harbor facility the way a man talks about something he built, with the specific, involuntary pride of someone who cannot help but admire the architecture even while dismantling it. 3 buildings arranged around a central loading yard. The primary structure was a converted cold storage facility, reinforced, with entry points at the north and east faces only. The west wall was solid concrete poured in 2019. The south face opened onto deep water. Internal security ran on a closed-circuit system not connected to any external network. Lorenzo operated it through a logistics shell that, on paper, processed refrigerated freight for 3 European retail chains. He described the guard rotation. 12 men on standard deployment, with a rapid response team of 8 that could be activated from a secondary position 4 minutes away by vehicle. The rapid response team was the variable. Engaging the primary facility without neutralizing the secondary position first meant absorbing a reinforcement wave before any objective could be secured. He told her the access codes for the eastern entry. He told her the rotation schedule had a natural gap at the shift change between 2200 and 2215. He told her where Lorenzo would be, not in the main facility, in a separate control room positioned in the loading crane structure overlooking the yard, elevated, defensible, with sight lines across all 3 buildings and a private exit to a boat dock on the water's edge. "He never puts himself in the building with the asset," Matteo said. His voice had gone flat, the voice of a man past a particular kind of shame into something more functional. He learned that in Naples in 2011. He'll be watching from the crane. He'll want to see it. Elara processed all of it. She ran the structure against what she knew about timing, about the people she could trust, about Dante. "He'll have cameras on Adrian," she said. "Yes, the broadcast setup will be in the primary structure. The execution would happen in the loading yard for sightlines." He paused. "The 6-hour window is real. He means it." "I know he means it." She pushed off the wall. "That's why we're not going to spend any more time standing in this room." She looked at Carla. Carla looked back at her. Elara said, You stay here. You don't make any calls. You don't send anything." She paused. "I'm not going to decide what happens to you right now. Right now I don't have time for it." Carla said, very quietly, "Be careful." Elara walked out of the room. She didn't answer. She had 4.5 hours. The encrypted message went out to 6 people in the first 8 minutes. The 3 fully trusted figures Pharaoh had identified, plus 2 senior field commanders whose loyalty she had spent 11 days assessing through observation rather than assumption, plus Pharaoh herself. The message contained the facility layout, the guard information, the shift change window, and a single line of operational instruction. Then she went to Dante. He was more alert than he'd been that morning, which was something, though the gray was still in his face and the medical equipment still hummed its quiet insistence around him. He read the message on the tablet she handed him without speaking, and when he finished, he set the tablet on the bed beside him and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "You can't lead this," he said. "There's no one else." "Elara." "Dante." Her voice was not unkind, but it had no give in it. "You have been unconscious for 7 of the last 11 days. Matteo has compromised at minimum 3 people inside this building, and possibly more that I haven't identified yet. Our 6 most trusted operational people are currently mobilizing based on information that came from Matteo De Luca at gunpoint, which is either accurate intelligence or a trap I don't have time to fully evaluate." She sat in the chair beside him. And Adrian Cross is in a shipping container in the South Harbor with 6 hours before Lorenzo broadcasts his execution across the underworld as a message to anyone who stands with me. The room was quiet. He's there because of me, she said. Because he made calls he didn't have to make, passed information he didn't have to pass, put himself in Lorenzo's sightline when I specifically told him not to. She paused. He did it anyway. Dante looked at her. Something moved in his eyes. Not sentiment, something more complicated. The assessment of a man who has spent decades reading what people do when the cost gets real. He walked into it, Dante said. He walked into it for the right reasons. She held Dante's gaze. Which is more than I can say for almost everyone else in this situation. A silence. The secondary position, Dante said. The rapid response team 4 minutes out. That's the variable. I know. If you can't neutralize them before they're activated, I know, she said again. I'm going to split the approach. Primary team goes for the facility at the shift change. I go for the crane early. Hit the control room before Lorenzo knows the main assault has started, cut off his ability to activate the secondary team from the crane position, and deny him the exit to the water. She paused. If I can get to him before he knows what's happening, the secondary team never gets the call. Dante was quiet for a long moment. And if you can't? She didn't answer because the answer was the kind that didn't help anything. He reached out and put his hand on her forearm. His grip was weaker than she'd ever felt it, which told her more about the wound than anything the medical team had said. I'm going to be very clear with you, he said. If this goes wrong, it won't. Alara. His voice was sharp enough to cut through the room. If this goes wrong, the evidence package you described to Matteo, is it real? She looked at him. It's real, she said. It goes out automatically if I don't cancel it within 8 hours. Good. He released her arm. Then at minimum, the organization survives you. He held her gaze. Come back anyway. She stood up. Tell me something, she said. Matteo, all those years, did you ever? No. His voice was immediate, absolute. There was nothing. Nothing I saw that should have told me. A pause, and something fractured slightly at the edge of his voice before he controlled it. That is the thing I'm going to have to live with. She nodded once. She left. Us. The harbor was cold and smelled of diesel and salt water and the particular industrial staleness of a port facility that processed things people weren't meant to look at too closely. The sky was low, pressing down toward the water in layers of gray that promised rain before midnight. Alara was in position on the crane superstructure at 21:43, 17 minutes before the shift change at the primary facility. Getting there had required 40 minutes of movement through the port's outer perimeter in conditions that were technical rather than violent, cutting through a fence section, crossing 300 meters of open yard using the shadows thrown by container stacks, climbing the crane's external service ladder with her hands cold enough that she felt the grip more than she felt her fingers. The wind off the water pushed at her steadily, and she pressed herself against the lattice steel and climbed and did not look down. The control room was a reinforced booth at the operator's level, 60 meters up. Through its windows, she could see light. Movement. She counted 2 figures. One of them, by the height and the way he stood, shoulders back, one hand in his jacket pocket, the stillness of someone very accustomed to elevated positions, was Lorenzo Baresi. She was early. The primary team wouldn't move for 17 minutes. She needed Lorenzo occupied, unaware, not reaching for communications, for those 17 minutes, and then for however long it took her people to get through the eastern entry and across the loading yard. She came over the top of the crane onto the operator's access walkway and moved along it with her back against the steel, the gun in her right hand and the wind trying to take her balance with every step. The door to the control room was on the windward side. It would open toward her. The second figure was closer to the door. She could see him more clearly now, a heavy-set man in tactical gear who was standing rather than sitting, which meant he was a guard rather than a technician. She had approximately 4 seconds from the moment the door opened to the moment anyone inside the booth could get to communications. She'd been trained, very specifically, on what you could do in 4 seconds. She went through the door. The guard was fast. She'd give him that. He was fast, and he'd been paying attention, and the moment the door came open, he was already turning, already reaching. But the reaching was toward his weapon, and not toward the console. And that was the choice that decided the next 4 seconds. She took him down, and the noise of it was brief, and the guard hit the floor of the control room and did not get up. Lorenzo Baresi had moved to the far side of the console. He had not reached for a weapon. He had reached for a radio. She got to him before he keyed it. She had the radio in her hand and his wrist bent at an angle that was not comfortable, and Lorenzo Baresi was pressed against the console looking at her with an expression she hadn't expected. Not fear, not fury, but something almost close to curiosity. The look of a man who has spent 20 years playing a very long game and has just encountered a move he didn't see coming. "You're early," he said. His voice was completely level. "Yes," she said. "How much do you know?" "Everything Matteo told me." A flicker across his face. The first genuine reaction. "He talked." At length. Lorenzo looked at her for a moment. Then, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone making a point, he looked at the console in front of him, at the screen showing the interior of the primary facility, at the feed from the loading yard below, at Adrian Cross. He was in a chair in the center of the loading yard, visible on the monitor in the flat wash of the facility's work lights. His hands were secured behind him. His face was... She'd been avoiding looking at the monitor since she came through the door, a discipline she now had to override. His face was marked up, lip split, a cut above one eye that had dried dark. He was conscious. He was sitting upright with the particular rigid quality of someone who has decided that posture is the thing they can still control. Something moved through her chest. She controlled it. "He's alive," she said. For the moment. Lorenzo's voice was pleasant. "You understand the architecture of this. You being here early creates a problem for me, yes, but it also creates a problem for him. My people in the yard have a standing instruction that activates the moment anything interrupts my control of this feed." He nodded toward the console. "If that feed drops, if communications go down, if I don't check in within..." He glanced at his watch. 3 minutes. The instruction activates. She looked at the console, at Adrian. She understood the architecture. He'd built it anticipating exactly this. Someone coming for the crane, someone trying to cut off communications, and he'd tied the outcome for the asset in the yard to the maintenance of the control room's function. Cutting him off didn't save Adrian. It triggered the execution. "So," Lorenzo said, "we have a situation where your early arrival has actually created a standoff rather than a resolution, which is interesting." He tilted his head. "You can't cut my communications. You can't take me out of this room. And in..." He checked his watch again. "About 12 minutes. My shift rotation will cycle, and the 16 men now on break will add to the 12 already in the facility. Your main assault, which I am confident is coming at the shift change, will hit a much harder target than you planned." He paused. "Unless we talk." "We're talking," she said. "I mean actually talk, about what comes after." His voice had shifted into something she recognized, the register of a negotiator, someone who had survived decades of impossible situations by finding the geometry of a deal. "Matteo has been exposed. His operation inside the Moretti Council is blown. He has nothing left." A pause. "I, on the other hand, have been his instrument without his full transparency. There are things I've done that cannot be undone, but there are also things I haven't done, things I've prevented." He held her gaze. "Your mother's death. I want you to know that I did not order that." "I know," she said. "Matteo did." Something shifted in his face, surprise, genuine, the look of a man recalibrating who knows what. "Then you understand that my position in relation to your family's history is not what..." "Lorenzo." Her voice was flat. "Stop." She looked at him directly. "I'm not interested in your position on my mother. I'm not interested in what you ordered versus what you didn't. I'm interested in Adrian Cross being alive in 4 hours. I'm interested in you picking up that console right now and telling your people in the yard to stand down. And I'm interested in you understanding that the thing you're about to offer me, whatever deal you've been building toward in the last 2 minutes, is not a negotiation. It's a surrender. The only question is what kind." He looked at her. "You sound like Dante," he said. "No," she said. Dante would have been more polite. She pressed his wrist slightly harder. "Check in, right now, keep the feed running, and then we're going to stand here together and watch my people come through that eastern entry and cross your loading yard, and you're going to use this console to make sure not one of your men fires a shot. Because the alternative, she let him feel the geometry of his position against the console, is not a version where you walk out of this building. A beat. Lorenzo Baresi looked at the console, at the feed, at Adrian in the chair below. He picked up the communication panel. He checked in. The 3-minute clock reset. Good, Ilara said. She did not relax. Her grip did not change. Now we wait. 200. Came in the eastern entry blue at 22:01. She watched it on the console. The charge that took the reinforced door off its tracks. The 6-second gap before her people came through. The disciplined spread of entry that her 2 field commanders had drilled into the team in the 90 minutes of preparation they'd had. On the loading yard feed, she could see Lorenzo's people reacting. Weapons coming up, movement toward cover. And she watched Lorenzo and he did not reach for communications because her hand was on his arm and the geometry of the room had not changed. The firefight in the facility was ugly and loud, and she could hear it even 60 meters up through the steel of the crane, a percussion of controlled violence that echoed off the water and the container stacks and the low gray sky. She watched the feeds and read the tactical situation in real time and made 2 calls. One to redirect her people around a flanking position Lorenzo's team had taken up behind the secondary building. One to bring the reserve element through the western approach using a maintenance access Matteo had described. Lorenzo watched her work. She was aware of him watching. She was aware of him reading her. The same way she'd been reading the building, the feeds, the situation. He was a man who had survived by understanding what he was dealing with, and he was updating his understanding in real time, and she let him, because what he was learning was exactly what she wanted him to know. The firefight lasted 11 minutes. At 22:13, her primary commander's voice came over the encrypted line. Yard is ours. Asset is secure and mobile. Adrian was alive. She exhaled once, controlled. She did not close her eyes. It's over, she said to Lorenzo. He looked at the console, at the yard below, where her people were moving through the aftermath with the efficient care of professionals. At the chair where Adrian had been sitting, which was now empty because Adrian was no longer in it, because someone had gotten to him and cut him free, and he was somewhere in that facility right now breathing the cold harbor air and being alive. Yes, Lorenzo said. He sounded surprisingly very tired. Not defeated, tired. The specific fatigue of someone who has been at war for 20 years and has just fully understood that this particular iteration of the war is done. You're going to stand trial, she said, within the legitimate structures, not ours. He looked at her. You're serious. Part of what I'm building, she said, is a version of this world where the accounting happens in the light, where possible. She held his gaze. That's your offer. Trial, lawyers, process. A beat. Or the alternative. The alternative being. We don't discuss it. He was quiet for a moment, then, Matteo. Matteo will face the same offer. He won't accept it. I know, she said. Something moved across Lorenzo Baresi's face. The complicated expression of a man thinking about the person who had built him into a weapon and aimed him at targets for 2 decades without full transparency, and arriving at a feeling about that person that was not quite rage, but lived in the same neighborhood. All right, he said. She came down the crane at 22:31 with the rain starting, light and cold, the kind of rain that doesn't announce itself but is simply there when you're not expecting it. Adrian was at the eastern entry with one of her field commanders, a blanket around his shoulders that he clearly hadn't asked for and wasn't sure what to do with. He was standing upright, which told her his legs were working. The cut above his eye had been roughly dressed. He was looking out at the harbor when she came across the yard, and he turned when she was 8 meters away, and they looked at each other across the wet concrete in the rain and the aftermath. He looked terrible. He also looked like a man who had made a specific accounting of himself and arrived at something he hadn't had before. Lorenzo, he said, in custody. He'll stand trial. Matteo. My people are bringing him in now. She stopped in front of him. You were told to go somewhere public and stay there. I know, he said. You didn't. No. He looked at her. The rain was starting to come harder now, and neither of them moved out of it. They came for me at the hotel, 2 men. I think they were watching me from the time I left the office. He paused. I didn't make it easy for them, for what it's worth. She looked at his face, the cut, the bruising along his jaw, the way he was holding his left shoulder slightly wrong. You fought them. Not successfully, he said. But yes. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across her face. You're an idiot, she said. Probably. He looked at her steadily. Elara, I need to say something. Adrian, just let me say it. His voice was rough, not from injury, from the specific roughness of something that has been building for a long time and has finally arrived at the surface. I signed those papers without looking up from my phone, and I have spent the last... He stopped, recalibrated. The last several weeks understanding what kind of man does that, and why, and what it costs. Not what it cost you, what it cost me. The person I was when I did it. He paused. I'm not asking you for anything. This isn't that kind of speech. I just needed you to know that I understand what I did, and that what I did after, the calls, Cho, Pharaoh, all of it, that wasn't atonement. That was just the thing that needed doing. I would have done it regardless. She looked at him. In the rain, with the harbor behind him, and the sounds of her people clearing the facility around them, she looked at the man she had lived beside for 5 years and had underestimated in the same way he had underestimated her. Not because he wasn't intelligent, but because she'd been so practiced at being invisible that she'd made it easy for everyone around her to not quite see. I know, she said. I know you would have. His shoulder dropped slightly, the left one, and she understood it had nothing to do with the injury. Okay, he said. Okay. He looked out at the harbor for a moment, then back at her. Is it done? Is it actually... The shot came from the crane. One shot, high velocity, from 60 meters up, and it was aimed at her, and it did not hit her because Adrian moved. He moved without thinking. That was the thing she would come back to, later, in the months that followed, when she was trying to understand what she'd seen. No calculation, no decision she could identify. He simply moved, putting himself between her and the sight line of the shot in the half-second that was available to do anything at all. The bullet took him in the upper left side. He went down hard on the wet concrete and she was already moving toward him, then up toward the crane, because the shooter was still in position and a second shot was coming and she needed to give the position to her field team immediately, and she needed to get to him and she couldn't do both, and she did both. Her field commander was already on it. She heard the orders going out as she dropped to her knees beside Adrian, and her hands went to the wound by instinct, pressure, immediate and hard, because that was what you did. Don't, he said. Shut up, she said. I can't tell if that was brave or just... Shut up, Adrian. Her hands were pressed against him and the rain was coming harder, and she could hear her people converging on the crane, and she was looking at his face and keeping the pressure and doing both. And the math of him being alive was a calculation she refused to let go of. Stay with me. I'm staying, he said. His voice was thinner, but it was there. I'm staying. Above them, in the crane structure, a second shot rang out, and then a third, and then silence, the specific silence of a firefight that has reached its conclusion. She looked up. Her field commander's voice came over the line. Crane is clear. Shooter is down. Identity, she said. A pause. It's Matteo De Luca, the commander said. He was in the crane. He got there. I don't know how he got there. We had him in transit. He knew the facility, she said. Matteo, who had built this place's counterpart in his head during 19 minutes of talking. Matteo, who had described it with the pride of someone who knew it intimately because he'd helped design it. He knew it better than I did. She looked back down at Adrian. His eyes were open. His jaw was set. His hand had come up and covered hers against the wound, not pushing her away, just there, pressing with her, adding whatever he had to the work of keeping him inside this moment and not somewhere else. How bad, he said. She looked at the wound, at what she could assess from what she had. You're not going to die, she said, and she said it with the flat certainty of a fact rather than a wish, because he needed a fact and not a wish right now. You don't know that. I do, she said. I've seen worse and I'm very good at this. Don't argue with me about things I'm right about. Something moved across his face. Not a smile exactly, the foundation of one. Okay, he said. Her people were there in 40 seconds with the medical kit, and she stayed at his side, and the rain came down and the harbor moved in the darkness beyond the facility's lights. And somewhere in the crane above them, the man who had built 23 years of careful destruction had reached the end of everything he'd been building toward. She kept her hands where they were, and kept the pressure, and kept her eyes on Adrian's face, and waited for the helicopter she'd already called, which was 4 minutes out, which was inside the margin, which was going to be enough. It had to be enough. She had not come this far, through all of it, to lose him on a concrete yard in the rain to a man who should have been stopped 20 years ago by people who should have been paying attention. "Talk to me," she said to Adrian. "About what?" "Anything. Just keep talking." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the careful precision of someone who is marshaling their resources and choosing what to spend them on, he said, "I've been thinking about what I want to do after all of this. Not the company, not the acquisitions, the board meetings, none of that. Something different." "Tell me," she said. And he told her, and she listened, and the helicopter came in low over the harbor with its lights cutting through the rain, and below the crane where Matteo De Luca lay still at last. The long war that had consumed her family for 23 years was drawing toward its final breath. Show more. The helicopter set down on the roof of the Moretti Medical Facility outside Geneva at 23:09, and by 23:11 Adrian Cross was in surgery. Alara stood in the corridor outside the operating theater and did not sit down, because sitting down felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make. She stood with her back against the wall, and her arms crossed and her hands still carrying the dried evidence of the last hour. And she looked at the middle distance and ran through everything that still needed doing. There was a great deal that still needed doing. Pharaoh found her at 23:40 and stood beside her without speaking for a moment, which was one of the things Alara had always valued about Cecilia Pharaoh. The woman understood that silence was sometimes the most functional response to a situation and did not fill it with words that served no purpose. "Matteo," Alara said. "Confirmed deceased," Pharaoh said. "The shooter who came off the crane. He took 2 rounds from your field team before he went down. He was already wounded when they reached him. He didn't survive the night." Alara absorbed that. The man who had killed her mother, who had embedded himself in the architecture of her family for 23 years, who had built a conspiracy so patient and so precisely maintained that even Dante, who had spent 30 years learning to read people the way other people read weather, had never seen it. Dead on a wet loading dock in the South Harbor, not in a courtroom, not at the end of a formal accounting. She'd wanted the courtroom. She'd offered him the courtroom. He'd made a different choice. "Lorenzo is in secure custody," Pharaoh continued. "His attorneys are already involved. The jurisdictional question is going to be complicated. There are 3 countries with legitimate claims. But the evidence package is substantial enough that I don't anticipate him functioning freely at any point in the foreseeable future." A pause. "His testimony, which his attorneys are already signaling he may offer in exchange for certain considerations, will be useful in documenting Matteo's operation, the internal council members who were compromised." "Reyes and Soren," Alara said. "And 2 others we didn't have," Pharaoh said. "Matteo's network inside the organization was more extensive than your observations identified. 4 people total, all in custody." "Carla." A pause. "She cooperated fully once it became clear that the operation had failed. She provided documentation. She'd kept records apparently for years. A kind of insurance." Pharaoh's voice was careful. "What she provided has been enormously useful in filling in the evidentiary record about your mother's death." Alara said nothing for a moment. "She kept records," she said, "for 20 years. Everything." Matteo told her. Everything she witnessed. Everything she was asked to facilitate and did facilitate and sometimes didn't. Pharaoh paused. "She says she was waiting for a moment when it was safe to use them. She may have been waiting for you." Alara thought about Carla telling a 6-year-old girl that the world was not as large as it seemed from inside these walls. She thought about what it would mean if that had been, in some buried and imperfect and deeply human way, a kind of apology in advance. "What happens to her is a legal question," Alara said finally. "Not mine to decide unilaterally." "No," Pharaoh agreed. They stood in the corridor. "Dante," Alara said. "He's been briefed. He knows everything. Pharaoh stopped, which was unusual enough that Alara looked at her. "He asked to see you when you're ready. He said to tell you he's not going anywhere, so there's no urgency. Those were his exact words. Alara looked back at the operating theater door. "When Cross is out of surgery," she said. Adrian came out of surgery at 0147. The surgeon was a compact, precise man named Dr. Vass, who had been working for the Moretti organization's medical division for 11 years and had the particular bedside manner of someone who understood that the people he treated were not interested in euphemism. He told Alara that the bullet had fractured a rib, nicked the lower lobe of the left lung, and missed every artery in the vicinity by margins that he described as, quote, sufficient. He told her Adrian would need 4 to 6 weeks of recovery and should not, under any circumstances, engage in physical confrontations or strenuous activity during that period. He said this with the specific tone of a man who had worked for this organization long enough to know that the instruction would probably not be followed and was issuing it for the record. Alara thanked him. She went in. Adrian was conscious, which surprised her slightly. He was propped at a slight angle in the hospital bed, still with the gray pallor of someone whose body had been through significant violence in the last several hours. But his eyes were open, and they tracked her when she came through the door, and she could see the effort it took him to maintain the alertness he was projecting. She pulled the chair up and sat beside him. "Matteo," he said. His voice was rough, stripped down. "Dead." He took that in. "Not the courtroom." "No." "Are you—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Okay, wrong question. Is it over?" "The acute part," she said. "The rest is going to take a long time. Years." She looked at him directly. "Lorenzo will cooperate to some extent to mitigate his legal exposure." That testimony, combined with what Carla documented and what Faro has been assembling, is enough to dismantle the structural damage Matteo did to the organization over 2 decades, identify who was compromised, rebuild the command integrity. A pause. "It's not a clean ending. There isn't one." "There usually isn't," he said. She looked at his face. The cut above his eye had been properly dressed now, and the bruising along his jaw was darkening into the colors of the next week. He looked like a man who had been through something and survived it, and was currently in the early hours of understanding what surviving it meant. "You moved," she said. He looked at her. "When the shot came," she said, "you moved before you could have thought about it." "I know," he said. "That kind of thing—" She stopped, started again. "That's not something you reason your way into. That's just what's there." He held her gaze. "Alara, I spent 5 years not seeing you, not because you weren't visible, because I was looking at everything except what was actually in front of me." He said it without drama, just the flat statement of a man giving testimony about himself. "What's there now? What made me move? That's not new. It's just the first time I've acted on it without filtering it through everything else I thought was more important." The room was quiet. The machines hummed. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. Again, the same thing he'd said in the yard. "I know," she said. "You said that already." "I mean it. I know you mean it." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Rest. We'll talk when you're not operating on pain medication and blood loss." Something almost like a smile. "That's not a no." "It's not a no," she said. "It's a not yet." She stood. She put her hand briefly on his forearm. Not the wounded side, the other one. Just for a moment, just enough to be there. Then she went to see Dante. "I was sitting up." That was the first thing. Not lying down, not propped at the angle of a man accommodating a wound, but actually sitting up on the edge of the bed with his feet on the floor, and the posture of a man who has decided that horizontal was not an acceptable way to have a particular conversation. He looked like he'd paid for the position, but he'd paid it anyway. Alara stood in the doorway and looked at him. "Don't," she said. "You're going to tear something." "I've already torn things," he said. "Sit down." She sat in the chair. He stayed where he was, upright on the edge of the bed, and for a moment they looked at each other in the way of two people who have known each other through enough versions of the world that certain preliminaries are not necessary. "Tell me what you actually know about your mother," he said. "Not what you told Matteo to destabilize him, what you actually have." She looked at him steadily. "Everything," she said. "I've had it for 4 years." His jaw tightened. "Before I married Adrian," she said, "I had already assembled most of it, the timeline, the people involved, the decision that was made." She paused. I came to you, Dante. Do you remember? 3 months before I met Adrian. I told you I wanted to go over what you knew about the night my mother died. I remember, he said quietly. You told me you'd looked into it thoroughly, and the conclusion was that it had been a Baresi operation. External, nothing internal. She held his gaze. I believed you, for a while. And then I kept looking, because something in it didn't sit right. And the more I looked, the more I understood that the account you'd been given, the account you believed, Dante, I'm not saying you knew, had been constructed by the same person who constructed everything else. Matteo, he said. Matteo managed the investigation. Matteo brought you the conclusions. Matteo was the person who told you it was Baresi, which was partially true. Baresi's people were involved at the operational level, but which omitted the fact that the decision had originated inside this house. She paused. When I understood that, I also understood that coming to you with the evidence wasn't safe. Not because I didn't trust you, because I didn't know yet how deep Matteo's influence went inside the organization. How many people were his? I didn't know if telling you would get you killed. Dante was very still. So you got yourself hidden, he said. I found Adrian, she said, which was not entirely strategic. She stopped. He was real, in a way that a lot of things in my life at that point weren't. I told myself it was cover. For a while I told myself that. A pause. It wasn't only cover. Something moved across Dante's face. Not surprise. Dante was rarely surprised. Something more like recognition, the adjustment of a man who has been carrying a version of a story and is now holding the actual version and finding the differences significant. Why didn't you tell me, he said, when you came back? Why did you let me believe? Because I needed to know which people inside this organization were Matteo's before I exposed what I knew, she said. If I'd told you immediately, Matteo would have known within hours through one of his 4 people on the council. He'd have moved faster. You'd have been in more danger, not less. And I needed... She stopped. Her voice was still controlled, but the control was costing her something visible for the first time in this conversation. I needed to do it right. I needed to build it carefully enough that it would actually hold. Because my mother deserved that. She deserved something that actually held. The room was quiet for a long time. She did, Dante said. His voice had gone rough. She deserved a great deal more than she got from the people around her, from me included. He looked at the floor. I was 17 when I met your mother. I thought I understood what this world was. I didn't understand anything. He looked up. I have spent 23 years believing I failed her through carelessness. I didn't know I was failing her through deliberate blindness that someone else had installed. You didn't know, Ilara said. That's not comfort, Ilara. I know it isn't. I'm not offering it as comfort. I'm offering it as fact. She leaned forward. Dante, what I need from you right now, not forgiveness, not understanding, not a reckoning about the past. What I need is whether you're going to be able to stand beside me for what comes next. Because what comes next is going to be harder than what we just survived. He looked at her. What comes next? He said. Rebuilding, she said. Not what this organization was. Something different. Something that doesn't require a 16-year-old girl to be erased from her own history to protect her from the people who are supposed to be her family. She held his gaze. The trafficking operations that have been running under cover of legitimate logistics contracts, those end. The relationships with corrupt officials that have been maintained through coercion rather than mutual interest, those end. The network stays, the reach stays, the intelligence infrastructure, and the security capabilities stay. But the way those capabilities are used, she paused. That changes. He studied her for a long time. You've been planning this, he said. Not just the last 11 days, longer. Years, she said simply, while you were married to Adrian Cross and living in a penthouse in Chicago. I was not idle during that period, she said. Dante looked at her, and for a moment the severity of his face softened into something that was as close to the things she'd known as a child as she was going to get from him right now. Your mother, he said, would have been... Don't, she said gently. We don't need that. He stopped, nodded once. No, we don't. He straightened on the edge of the bed. What do you need from me first? Sleep, she said. and a formal transfer of council authority within 72 hours, once we've confirmed which council members are clean. She stood. The rest we'll build as we go. And the man upstairs, Dante said. Cross. She looked at him. He took a bullet for you, Dante said. It was a statement, not an accusation, not a question. Yes. Without hesitation. Without any, she said. Dante absorbed that. Something shifted in his face, the specific shift of a man updating a position he'd held for a long time. I've met a great many people in this world, he said, who would tell you they would take a bullet for someone they loved, and very few who would actually move. I know, she said. He's not built for this life, Dante said. I know that too. She held his gaze. Neither was my mother. It didn't stop her from loving someone who was. She paused. I'm not making decisions about my life based on what it's convenient for the organization. I did that for 5 years and I'm not doing it again. Dante looked at her for a long moment. No, he said finally. I don't suppose you should. He lowered himself back against the bed, carefully, the movement of a man respecting the damage to his body. Go sleep, Elara. Everything else will still be here in the morning. She moved toward the door. One more thing, Dante said. She stopped. Carla, he said, whatever the legal outcome is, whatever the accounting looks like, she kept your mother's memory alive, in her records, in the details she preserved. He was looking at the ceiling. That's worth something. I don't know what, but something. Elara thought about it. Yes, she said. It is. She left him to his rest. The formal council transfer happened on the 4th day. Not 72 hours, 4 days, because the confirmation process for the remaining council members was more complicated than Elara had planned, requiring individual verified interviews conducted by Pharaoh and 2 independent legal figures whose neutrality could not be questioned. Elara sat through every one. She watched faces and listened to answers and ran what she heard against what she'd observed in 11 days of walking the estate's corridors. And at the end of it, she had a council of 9 people she was confident in and 3 vacancies where compromised members had been removed. The vacancies could wait. 9 people who could be trusted was worth more than 12 who couldn't. The transfer itself was brief and without ceremony, which was intentional. Ceremony was a way of asserting that something extraordinary was happening. Elara did not want the organization to feel like what it was doing was extraordinary. She wanted it to feel like a correction, a system returning to its proper calibration after an extended malfunction. She sat at the head of the council table and looked at the 9 faces around it and said simply that the first order of business was a full structural audit of every logistics contract currently active, with specific attention to routes and counterparties connected to the 3 shell companies Lorenzo had used. The audit would be completed within 30 days. Any contract that could not survive scrutiny would be terminated. The second order of business was the establishment of an internal review mechanism that reported to the council collectively and not to any single authority, a structure designed specifically to prevent the concentration of influence that Matteo had exploited. The third order of business was a formal acknowledgement entered into the organizational record of what had been done to Elara's mother and by whom. That one took the longest, not because anyone objected, because doing it properly, stating it plainly, in language that didn't hedge or soften or distribute responsibility in ways that made it easier to carry, required care. She wrote that section herself and read it aloud to the council, and when she finished, the room was very quiet, and she let the quiet be there for a moment before moving on. After the meeting, Pharaoh walked with her down the corridor toward the estate's main entrance and said, "You didn't mention what happens to the operational side, the security contracting, the intelligence network." "I mentioned the audit," Elara said. "You didn't mention the future shape of it." "No." She pushed open the door to the exterior. The day was clear, the first genuinely clear day since she'd come back. The sky over Geneva pale and cold, and very clean. "I'm not announcing a future shape. I'm building it. There's a difference." She stopped on the steps and looked out at the grounds. "If I announce a vision, it becomes something people can debate or undermine before it exists. If I build it, it becomes real before anyone has decided whether they're going to oppose it." Pharaoh stood beside her. "Your mother worked the same way," she said. Elara looked at her. "I knew her," Pharaoh said. "Not well." I was young, and she was everything people tell you she was, but also more pragmatic than the stories allow. She didn't talk about what she intended. She did things, and then the things existed. A pause. You have her eyes. You always did. But watching you run that council meeting, you have something else of hers I didn't expect. What? Patience, Pharaoh said. Real patience. The kind that doesn't feel like waiting. The kind that feels like building. Ilara looked out at the grounds for a moment longer. Go do your work, Cecilia, she said. Pharaoh almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. Adrian was sitting up on the third day, which Dr. Vass had not sanctioned and which Adrian had done anyway, and by the eighth day he was walking the corridor outside his room with the careful, slightly listing quality of a man whose body was issuing constant advisories that he was declining to follow completely. Ilara came by in the evenings when the day's work was done. She didn't stay long. She sat in the chair beside his bed and they talked. Not about what had happened, not yet, but about other things. The kind of things you talk about when you are two people who have shared a life and are now sitting in the ruins of the version of it they both misunderstood, trying to find out what's actually underneath. He told her about his father. A real account, not the abbreviated professional biography version. His father had built something modest and real and had never made his son feel that modest and real was enough. And Adrian had spent 30 years in furious motion trying to construct something that would have been enough, and had never once stopped to ask whether his father's opinion of his choices was actually a standard he'd elected to accept, or simply one he'd inherited without examination. She told him about Lyon, the years before the manufactured identity, which had not been all fear and contingency. There had been an apartment with a view of rooftops and a woman named Sylvie, who taught her to make pastry in a whole season, where she'd genuinely thought, that the ordinary life was going to be enough. Was it? Adrian asked. For a while, she said, and then it wasn't, and then I met you, and it was something else. Something else, he said, not pressing, just receiving. Something that mattered, she said, in ways I didn't always know how to say, in ways you didn't always know how to hear, and I don't think either of those things was entirely anyone's fault. We were both people who had learned to keep the important things very far inside. A pause. That's not an excuse for what didn't work. It's just what I think was true. He was quiet for a moment. What you said in the yard. Not yet. Yes. Is that still? Yes, she said. It's still not yet. Not no. She looked at him directly. I have a great deal of work in front of me. Years of it. And I don't know what shape my life is going to take as I do it, and I'm not willing to make commitments to things I can't see clearly yet. That's not about you. That's about me having spent a long time making accommodations to everyone else's version of who I was supposed to be and deciding that I'm done with that. That's fair, he said. It is, she agreed. But what I can tell you, what I know clearly enough to say, is that you are not nothing to me. You have not been nothing to me for a very long time, even when I was angry, even when I was invisible inside my own marriage, even when I signed those papers and walked out of that building. You were not nothing. He looked at her, and she could see the work it was costing him to not say whatever was sitting behind his eyes, to simply receive what she was offering without reaching past it for more. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. She stood up and he reached out and she let him take her hand for a moment, and they stayed like that, without saying anything. And then she left, and he let her go, and outside the window. Geneva's evening settled into the particular stillness of a city that had nothing to do with any of this and would be going about its business regardless. He left 6 weeks later. Dr. Vass cleared him for travel, and Adrian Cross left the Moretti Medical Facility with a single bag and a follow-up schedule and the address of a physical therapist in Chicago who was expecting him. He stood in the facility's entrance foyer with his jacket on and his bag at his feet and looked at nothing in particular. Ilara came down to see him off. She looked different than she had 6 weeks ago. The same person, same eyes, same quality of stillness, same way of standing that he'd spent 5 years categorizing as simply how she stood and now understood was the posture of someone who had learned to take up exactly the space they intended. But something had settled in her, a quality he didn't quite have language for. Not hardness. Not the kind of toughness that comes from closing things off. Something more like integration. the sense of a person who has finally become the same person in every room. "The company," she said. "Thomas Reeves is managing it. Interim. I'm thinking about a different direction." He told her some of this in the evenings. Not all. The communities in the areas where Baresi and Matteo operated, the ones that got caught in the infrastructure of what they built, the legitimate-looking supply chains that were moving other things, the logistics operations that employed people who had no idea what they were adjacent to. When those structures come down, the communities that depended on them as employers don't get a grace period. He paused. "I have resources. I have people who owe me things. I think I'm going to figure out how to be useful in a way that doesn't require me to be the protagonist of my own story." She looked at him. "That's a significant change," she said. "I've had time to think," he said. 6 weeks in a hospital bed will do that. Turns out getting shot is clarifying." He picked up his bag. "I meant what I said. I'm not waiting for anything. I'm not holding a place. Whatever I'm doing next, I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, not because I'm angling for a different outcome with you." "I know," she said. "I just want to be clear." "Adrian." Her voice was quiet. "You're clear. You've been clear." She looked at him for a moment. "Take care of yourself. Actually follow the physical therapist's schedule." "I'll try." "Don't try, do it. You broke a rib and punctured a lung, and you're not going to recover correctly if you decide that discomfort is information you can ignore." "You sound like Vass." "Vass is right." She paused. "Check in when you're settled." He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not grief exactly. Something less clean than grief and more honest. The expression of a man standing at the edge of something he knows he can't step over yet, and choosing to stand where he is rather than fall. "Yeah," he said. "I will." He left. She watched through the entrance glass as the car pulled away, and she stood there until it was out of sight. And then she turned back toward the interior of the building and the work that was waiting, and she walked toward it with the steady, unhurried purposefulness of someone who knows the difference between what they're walking away from and what they're walking toward. Months passed. The structural audit of the logistics network was completed in 31 days, one day over Alara's target, which she accepted as a function of the audit being done correctly rather than quickly. 11 contracts were terminated. 4 were renegotiated. The shell companies Lorenzo had operated through were handed over to the relevant jurisdictional authorities, along with documentation that Pharaoh had spent 3 weeks assembling into a form that would be useful to prosecutors across 3 countries. Lorenzo Baresi stood trial in Brussels 11 months after the harbor. He cooperated substantially, as his attorneys had signaled he would. His testimony, combined with the documentary evidence, produced a legal reckoning that touched 37 individuals across 4 countries and was described by journalists covering the proceedings as one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions in European history. Alara did not attend the trial. She watched the summaries, read the transcripts that mattered, and spent the days of proceedings doing the work that had nothing to do with what Lorenzo was saying in a courtroom. Carla stood trial in a different jurisdiction, on different charges, under a cooperation agreement that reflected both what she had done and what she had preserved. She was convicted and sentenced. Alara provided a written statement to the court, not in mitigation and not in condemnation, a factual account of what Carla had given in those 20 years of records and what it had made possible. She did not attend the sentencing. Reyes and Soren and the 2 other compromise council members were processed through legal structures that Pharaoh had spent months building. Proper structures, with oversight, with rights, with the kind of accountability that didn't require disappearance as its mechanism. It was slower than the other way. It was more expensive. It held. Dante recovered. He recovered with the impatience of a man who had never been comfortable being dependent and the grudging discipline of a man who understood that impatience was going to cost him more time, not less if he didn't respect it. By the 4th month, he was walking the estate grounds each morning without the cane that Dr. Vass had recommended. By the 6th month, he was attending council meetings. By the 8th month, he was operational in all the ways that mattered, sitting to Alara's left at the head of the table, not at the head itself. He had not been asked to yield that position. He had simply stopped taking it, and she had not commented on it, and they had both understood without discussion that this was the correct adjustment. The Council of 9 became a Council of 12 again. The 3 vacancies filled with people who had been vetted with a rigor that the organization had never before applied to its own internal appointments. The vetting process was Alara's design and Pharaoh's implementation, and it was thorough enough that 3 of the initial candidates withdrew themselves rather than complete it. She took that as the correct outcome. The intelligence network that the Moretti organization had built over decades, the reach into financial systems, government structures, and the parallel economy that ran beneath the visible world. That network was not dismantled. Alara had never intended to dismantle it. What she dismantled was the purpose to which it had been directed. The trafficking infrastructure that had been embedded in the logistics network ceased to function within 60 days of the harbor, not because of a single decisive action, but because the supply chain it depended on was reconstructed around it in ways that left it without the concealment it required. The violent enforcement mechanisms that had operated in several markets were terminated through a combination of direct action and the removal of the financial incentives that had sustained them. What remained was an intelligence and security apparatus of considerable sophistication that operated on a principle Alara articulated to the council once and did not repeat, because she did not believe that principles needed to be repeated to people who had genuinely understood them, that power used to protect was not the same as power used to extract, and that the distinction was not semantic. It was the thing everything else depended on. She was not naive about what she was, about what the organization was. She had grown up understanding that the world contained structures that the surface world did not officially acknowledge, and that those structures were not going to disappear because someone wished them away. The question was not whether they existed. The question was what they were for. She was answering that question one decision at a time. Adrian sent a message in the 9th month. Not a long one. He was in a city in southern Italy, a coastal community where 3 of the Baresi logistics facilities had been the primary employers before they'd been shut down in the wake of the prosecution. He was working with a consortium of local organizations on a reconstruction effort focused on employment infrastructure. He'd brought in 2 people from his old company who had the specific skills the project needed. He said the physical therapist had cleared him at the 3-month mark. He said the rib hurt in cold weather, but otherwise he'd mostly forgotten about it. He said he'd been thinking about what she'd said, about not making commitments to things you can't see clearly yet, and that he understood it and respected it and was not reaching past it. He said he hoped she was well. At the bottom of the message, after a gap, he'd added, "I can see the water from where I'm working. It's very blue. I thought you'd want to know something ordinary." She read it twice. She wrote back, "I'm glad you're there. The water is blue here too. It usually is." She sent it and set her phone down on the desk and looked out through the window of the estate office at the grounds where the evening was settling into the last of the light, and she let herself for a moment simply be inside the quiet of it. Not the quiet of hiding, not the quiet of someone making themselves small. The quiet of a person who has done the day's work and knows that tomorrow there will be more work, and is not afraid of that, and is not rushing toward whatever comes next, but is simply here, in the evening, in the particular piece of a life that is finally, imperfectly, entirely her own. Somewhere in the city below, in the ordinary life that ran parallel to all of this and knew nothing of it, people were finishing their dinners and putting children to bed, and arguing about small things and laughing at other small things, and the world was turning at its usual pace without asking permission from anyone. Alara Vale, whose name was not only that, and had never been only that, and would never again need to be hidden behind any name at all, looked out at the evening and breathed and let the quiet be what it was. The war that had consumed 2 generations was over. What came after it was beginning.